Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I have a slight diversion from the A-level specification on attachment, and this is intended to kind of give you that kind of feedback of maternal deprivation that you'll need in order to understand exactly kind of where this particular topic is going. Okay, and it's just kind of me putting a few things together, but it should hopefully help you understand the importance of maternal deprivation and perhaps the difference between that and privation. So the first question I'm going to ask is, what is worse? Okay, I want you to think about this, maybe pause the video and maybe think about what your answer would be. Having no attachment at all, or having an attachment that you did have with a parent, a primary attachment figure, that was eventually broken. So no attachment versus attachment that is broken. Now hopefully you did pause the video and you perhaps thought about it. I know you'll have many reasons for thinking either one is worse than the other. Now there is sometimes the kind of the thought that having something and then having it taken away from you, and kind of the idea of having attachment that is then broken, is worse, and sometimes when I ask classes, this is pretty much what they say, and kind of one of the reasons I kind of go through this particular lesson. Now, what I do want you to kind of think about is that this is something which comes kind of midway through the topic on attachment, and you would have certainly heard of Bowlby's internal working model. Maybe that will help you to kind of rethink what is worse. Okay, but let me try and put this in a different way. Here we have two characters. For those of you who have watched the films, and hopefully certainly those of you who would have read the stories, and I do appreciate this is not my material, it's J.K. Rowling's material on Harry Potter. We'll see two characters, Tom Riddle and Harry Potter. Now, if I had to ask you the question, who ultimately becomes the most evil or the most damaged wizard, I think all of you, if you know the stories, would say, well, Tom Riddle does, because he becomes Lord Voldemort. But Tom Riddle and Harry Potter actually have a lot in common. They're both of orphans. They both find Hogwarts as their home. But ultimately, we see that Tom Riddle goes on to perhaps explore darker paths, and Harry Potter doesn't. Now, Dumbledore sees this solution as being quite simple. It says that Harry Potter had love. Love as powerful as your mother's for you leaves its own mark. So let's think through that question. What is worse, having attachment which is lost, or not having attachment at all? A couple of other quotes there. So, do not pity the dead, Harry, pity the living, and above all, those who live without love. You are protected, in short, by your ability to love. This is Dumbledore talking to Harry Potter. To have been loved so deeply, even though the person who loved us is gone, will give us some protection forever. You think the dead we loved ever truly leave us? Now, I don't know about you, but it certainly sounds as if J.K. Rowling at some point possibly either studied a bit of psychology or certainly read into it. I suppose we could substitute the word love and talk about attachment. Attachment as powerful as your mother's for you leaves its own mark. Bowlby would have said that in terms of the internal working model. Do not pity the dead, Harry, pity the living, and above all those who live without attachment. you're protected, in short, by ability to attach. See, I think it's kind of, hopefully I've made my point. Okay, now it's not just me obsessed about Harry Potter. It's perhaps a few other things that you perhaps need to bear in mind. Bowlby did some work with Robertson, who went on to actually do some amazing kind of ideas, and he often gets to refer to these two as the PDD model, saying that children who perhaps are separated from their mothers end up actually going through the PDD model, and it actually stands for protest, despair, and detachment. All babies, once they kind of see their mothers leaving, will protest. Some of them will even, once they've been left, will go through despair, and the child may cry quietly, but ultimately become passive. It's a little bit disturbing to see a child that's perhaps not engaging. But the thing that Bowlby and Robertson noticed was this idea of detachment. It was almost as if somebody had to kind of rebuild the attachment bond. So not having attachment means that this protest, despair, detachment is kind of not kind of inbuilt, and we'll see when we go through some of Rutter's work and some of the criticisms of Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis, that potentially they had something else called privation, where they didn't have attachment at all. But certainly we see that it's kind of one of those things, because we kind of know the process of being attached to somebody, that we go through the PDD model. Now, Robertson was very aware that potentially children do sometimes get left by their mothers, and he observed children in this particular situation. And one of the famous people that he looked at was this girl called Laura, and there's quite a lot of footage that you can find. Often it's silent footage, and she kind of begs her parents to go home, and she really struggles to control her feelings, and she's kind of desperate to kind of be there with the mother. And I suppose that's the importance, that it is traumatic, but we do find that it's traumatic because there's something deep within her. Robertson, when with his partner, they decided to actually explore this a little bit further. And at the time, many babies were, when their mothers went into hospital to have another child, were often put in some form of care. And he had a perfect opportunity to perhaps observe children in this particular context. And one of the children that they observed was John. They said he was robust, but we see that actually through as little as 9 days, that they pretty much go through this process, and he became different. And this is despite the father visiting him regularly. And I suppose one of the concerns that we did have at the time was that nurses were assigned duties rather than children, so therefore it's quite easy to kind of forget about the individual emotional needs of children. And the reason I'm bringing up Robertson and Robertson is that they're part of this kind of movement for us to understand the importance of looking at the emotional needs of children. Also, this is something which I experienced when I was in hospital, that the mothers were only allowed to visit during visiting hours, and sometimes children were kept away from visiting their own parents when their parents were ill in hospital, and so this kind of forced separation was quite damning. Now, it's no longer part of the course, but Robertson and Robertson kind of started us kind of thinking about kind of what is the importance of that attachment bond. And they went on to kind of do this kind of famous study where they looked at maintaining the emotional bond, and they took children into their own homes, and they tried to follow normal routines, and they also asked them to kind of bring something from home, and they kind of took them to visit their mothers, and also having their fathers kind of visit them. And so instead of having that complete separation from from the the attachment figure, kind of they had something which they can substitute. They still had care, emotional care in their normal routines, seeing their parents, but also somebody cared for them. And Kate was a good example of this, and these are pictures of Robertson. Just absolutely wonderful people who did some fantastic research. And ultimately, they concluded that what they'd previously seen in John was this thing called bond disruption. And what they didn't see in Kate was that. They went on to say to minimize that problem, and certainly we can see this for fostering children. It says here that if you can have substitute emotional care, this will be very valuable and will minimize the effects of maternal deprivation. So even though we're going to learn about maternal deprivation, it's important for us to recognize that actually, we've moved on from that. We've seen that children can be cared emotionally for by other people, and that we need to kind of think and challenge our thoughts. The difference between Harry Potter and Tom Riddle ultimately was this idea that despite having the attachment being broken with his mother, Harry still had that bond, and ultimately when he goes to secondary school, he kind of forms friendships that kind of give him that substitute emotional care, and he goes on to kind of choose good over choosing evil. Where Voldemort never had that. He kind of never had anything to kind of build that kind of model on kind of what relationships should be, and Dumbledore even kind of makes the statement in the sixth book about he never really had friends. He just kind of had followers. Now, it's not to say that children who are separated from their maternal care aren't kind of disturbed. We typically find that there is something called attachment disorder. It's found in the DSM, and it's usually things like this. They have no preferred attachment figure, the inability to interact with others, and severe neglect and changes of caregivers. In some way, Tom Riddle potentially would have been this. He would have not had any kind of attachment figure at all. And we see that there's either two types of kind of reactions to this. One is reactive, which the child ends up being shy and withdrawn, and can't cope in social situations. And I think there's some evidence that this is actually quite a difficult place to be. But we also have disinhibited, where they potentially end up kind of being kind of clingy and over friendly and attention seeking. So part of this kind of side video was just to get you to see that there's kind of more to the A-level specification than just what we do, and that it is very interesting, and that kind of public figures and ideas and stories like Harry Potter certainly draw upon attachment, and in a way that perhaps we didn't realize when we read the books or watched the films. So the last kind of aspect of kind of deprivation that we could look at is extreme isolation. And certainly it's worth having a look at a case of a girl that the media named Jeannie. Curtis studied her, and she was a girl that was found in a cellar, neglected and physically restrained by her father. She was kind of about 13 years old, but she looked as if she was 7. So the size of a 6 or 7-year-old. She couldn't talk. She made very little noise, and she kind of walked in a funny way. She was unsocialized and primitive. And Curtis, certainly if you can find some videos on YouTube on this, kind of was interested in kind of finding out whether she ultimately could develop language after a time period which her brain had kind of finished. She failed to socialize, and ultimately was put into an institution. We do believe that perhaps this is extreme, very difficult for us to kind of understand it, but if you follow that link, you'll find that it can be really interesting to find kind of cases like this, where potentially the damning effect of not forming attachment is perhaps a lot more harsh than we ever thought. I hope you've enjoyed this. This is just a kind of a couple of thoughts that I wanted to put together before we do the maternal deprivation hypothesis, and you certainly kind of will learn a bit more about that in the next video. Thank you very much. Okay, bye.